afternoon. I'm Charles
Sorry, he's not scanning.
Corcoran, and this is Diana Peebler. And we're going to present a class today on recycling exclusions and exemptions. Most of it is going to be about Health and Safety Code 25143.2 and the definition of waste. Here's an overview of the class. Basically, we're going to look at what is recycling from a practical standpoint, and then from a legal definition standpoint, what is recycling. We'll then look at closed-loop recycling, Health and Safety Code 25143.2. We're going to go through that section by section with an overview. And then we're going to give a lot of examples of use or reuse and recycling, and talk about whether or not 25143.2 would apply to those examples. And then we'll look at on-site permit exemptions, and then the rest of 25143.2. After that, we'll go into various other recycling provisions, such as the statute for rags or scrap metal, et cetera, so on and so forth. And then we'll have time for questions and answers in any scenarios you guys would like to present or investigate. At any time throughout the presentation, please stop us and ask questions if you have questions. The more you participate, my experience, the better the class. So with that, we'll begin. Under the federal law, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, okay, or the Solid Waste Disposal Act, that is a statute that regulates hazardous waste recycling at the federal level. In the state of California, California Health and Safety Code, in Chapter 6.5, Section 25143.2 is the state's primary recycling statute. And those two statutes have a bit of a difference between them. The federal statute is very focused on recycling. In fact, you can tell from the name, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. The federal law likes to promote recycling, and it tells EPA to adopt regulations to promote recycling. Whereas the state law, the hazardous waste control law, has a little bit different focus when it comes to recycling. It's more command and control and less liberal with its exclusions and exemptions for recycling. So it follows then, with differences in the law, that there's differences in the regulations. At the federal level, the recycling regulations are in 40 CFR, and mainly it's in Part 261.2E, and nowadays also in 40 CFR 261.4. At the state level, the hazardous waste regulations are in Title 22, which you're all familiar with, but it's mainly in the definition of waste in 66261.2 in the recycling table, in the definition of hazardous waste, 66261.3, and then again in the hazardous waste determination procedure section in 66262.11. All three of those sections direct the generator who's making a hazardous waste determination back to 25143.2 in one way or another. So the real difference there is that in the federal scheme, you can just go to the regulations and you can figure out whether or not a material is a waste or a solid waste. You can figure out whether or not it's a solid waste and a hazardous waste, or whether it's excluded using the regulations and the regulations alone. In the state system, you can't get to the answer to that question or those questions unless you also open up the statute and look at the statute. The regulations at the state level are incomplete on this point. Throughout the presentation today, I'm going to have this diagram up here. This diagram we made a couple years ago for people to just pin on their cubicle wall. It allows you, if you have a material in front of you that you're trying to figure out its status, it allows you to look at this diagram by material type and then possibly find some exclusions or exemptions that might apply to that material. This chart's not complete. There are many, many regulations and a couple of statutes that I don't have on here, but it covers probably 80 to 90% of the recycling provisions. On this diagram, the material in red is really material that's destined for reclamation, and we'll talk about that a little more later. The green section are provisions that apply to materials that are going to be reused. The white is kind of a miscellaneous section, and the blue area includes both reuse and or reclamation, depending on the provision. All right, so what is recycling? A little class participation to get things moving. If forget the law for a minute, forget what you know about the regulations. If I asked you, as an everyday person, what is recycling, what do you think it is? Anybody? What is it? Okay, reuse, reusing something. What else? Anybody? Yeah, go ahead. Don't have to raise your hand.
When I wash out my containers that were used for beverages.
Okay, so putting a container in a recycle bin. What if I keep using the container? If I fill it back up? Reuse or repurposing. What else? How about these things? Do these spark any ideas? What about taking your gold to get it turned in for cash? And somebody's going to melt down that gold bracelet or that gold coin. Is that recycling? How about taking your household hazardous waste to the HHW collection facility where they might recycle it? Is that recycling? Maybe, maybe not. How about these old computer monitors going for recycling? Maybe. And the last one, when we all drive cars, right? So what about crushed cars waiting to get shredded? Is that possibly recycling? Okay. So yeah, all of those things could be recycling. So what is recycling? Using or reusing something? Yes. Using something beneficially instead of throwing it away. That's a good common example, common definition that people give a lot, okay? Finding a new use for something, redirecting, repurposing. A lot of people like to provide those answers. Okay. Recovering materials from a material, okay? That's reclaiming. Okay. Regenerating a chemical. We don't have a lot of industry here today, but if you had a lot of industry folks here, you'd get that answer a lot. So regenerating an acid, regenerating a solvent, regenerating a plating bath. Okay. How about refurbishing a piece of equipment? That mic over there, I think, needs refurbishing. Okay. A lot of people don't think of that as a form of recycling, but taking a piece of equipment that's no longer usable and refurbishing it is recycling. Okay. So these are all different kinds of recycling. So what's the real important point there? Recycling is more of a concept than it is a physical thing that you can point to, right? So in that concept, it takes on many, many different forms, and that the forms of recycling are virtually unlimited. As many kinds of materials there are out there and yet to be invented, someone will find a way to reuse or repurpose or redirect or recycle. So recycling is not one thing. It shows up everywhere and it takes many forms, okay? And that's a hard thing for some people to understand. It's not black and white, it's not cut and dry. But that's actually what makes it interesting when you get into the stuff that we're talking about here today, all right? So let's look at it legally. What does recycling mean legally in the hazardous waste control law or in the regulations? Recycling means two things under the regulations: using or reusing a material and reclaiming a material, okay? Now, the thing is, those words are further defined, okay? So reclamation means processing a material to recover a usable product or recover a material value, right? Also, like we said earlier, regenerating a material to make it usable once again, okay? So refortifying an acid, or bringing an acid back up to strength, or bringing a plating bath back up to strength. Those are examples of regenerating material, okay? The classic examples that are given in the regulations are recovering lead from spent lead acid batteries and distilling a solvent. All right? So, any questions on what reclamation is? All right. Okay. And then using or reusing. Okay, this phrase is defined in regulations. In theory, it means anything that is recycling that is not reclamation. Okay, but legally, it means something more. Legally, it means employing a material as an ingredient in an industrial process to produce a product, or employing a material as an effective substitute for a commercial product that you would otherwise acquire. Yeah. So used or reused doesn't really have the meaning that the everyday used or reused words would have in conversation. Any questions on that? Okay. So where does this fit in? In 66261.2, in the definition of waste, right? In subparagraph D, a material is designated as a waste in state law if it is recycled or if it is accumulated, stored, or treated before recycling. So I actually didn't get to recycling yet. I kind of just threw that bottle into the bin, and it's sitting there, right? Except as provided in Health and Safety Code 25.143.2. So remember earlier when I said those hazardous waste determination sections link you back or send you back to 25.143.2. This is where you'll find the first of those series of links that give you a chance to say, I'm not a waste because I'm recycling the material in a certain way. All right. Also in 66261.2, there's a table, or what some people call the dreaded table. Okay? This table applies only to recycling. It applies only in the context of recycling. You know, often I'll see people start to talk about this table in the context of disposal or something else, and that's inappropriate or incorrect. Okay? Down the left-hand side of the table, you have a whole bunch of types of materials. Okay? These are all categories of secondary materials. And the term secondary materials is used throughout the regulations, but it's never defined. Okay? And that causes problems for some people. Basically, secondary material in the regulations means any hazardous material which is potentially a hazardous waste. So some examples of spent materials include spent materials, or materials which have been used up. Okay? Sludges, which are things that come from air pollution control devices or wastewater treatment plants. All right? Byproducts, which are things that are unintentionally produced but just happen to appear as part of an operation. Okay? And unused commercial chemical products. All right? This last one's interesting because it says listed in section 66261.33, and that's one of many regulations that we have that we don't necessarily follow to the letter of the law. Okay? So there's a long history behind the regulation, but basically we borrowed it from US EPA scheme, and EPA years ago put a technical correction in the Federal Register saying, yeah, although we wrote listed in section 66261.33, that's not what we really mean. This means any commercial chemical product. So it's broader than the list.
Be it listed or characteristic.
Yeah, you can go further with this. This is not a hazardous waste identification class, but in fact, as Diana's pointing out, the phrase commercial chemical product throughout the regulations has two different meanings depending on which part of the regulations you're in. So it can get a little confusing. Okay? But we're not going to go into the details of that today. As Diana said, for what we're doing today, a commercial chemical product means any unused material. All right? So that was one regulation that we don't usually follow. Then the next one follows right behind it. It's that single asterisk down below. And it says except as excluded. Again, there's your link to 25.143.2. These materials are not eligible to be classified as a RCRA hazardous waste. Well, I've changed the footnote here on the screen. It doesn't match the regulations. And what I have here is how we generally apply the regulations. Okay? So materials with a single asterisk are generally regulated as a RCRA hazardous waste. Okay? But if you look at the regulation text, we don't generally apply it the way that it reads to the letter of law. Okay? All right, so going across the table to the right, we see some different, yeah? Sure. Okay, the single asterisk footnote here is not how it appears in Title 22. Okay, I've changed it here on the screen to give you a feel for how we actually apply the regulation, okay? So, yeah, so the actual footnote says that the material is not eligible to be classified as a non-RCRA hazardous waste, which means to most people, it's not eligible to non-RCRA, that means it is a RCRA hazardous waste, okay? But the table doesn't work. For example, I could have a spent material that's hazardous only for copper or zinc or nickel, something that EPA doesn't regulate. And this footnote would say it's a RCRA hazardous waste, even though EPA would never regulate it. So you see why I kind of had to adjust how we apply the regulation to make the table work. Okay, so going across to the right, you have 4 kinds of recycling. All right, and these are use constituting disposal, burning for energy or use as a fuel, reclamation, which we're talking about, and speculative accumulation. Okay. The table in California basically says, no matter what kind of material you are, and no matter how you recycle it in one of these 4 ways, you're identified as a waste. Right? That's different than the federal scheme, which says certain materials, when recycled in certain ways, are not solid waste, and hence not hazardous waste. All right, so I think I just went over this. But basically, this slide shows you what the table says in words, rather than in a pictorial view. Okay? In California, when materials are not wastes and not hazardous waste because of the way they are recycled, they're called excluded recyclable materials. All right? And they are less than fully regulated as hazardous waste, but they still have some regulation light, some Bud Light. There's still some regulations that attach to these materials. Okay? As compared to in the federal scheme, it's different. When a material is not a solid waste because of the way it's being managed or recycled, it's just completely out of regulation. Okay? There's a big difference in the 2 structures, and that goes back to the differences in the statute. Okay. So there's another way to say what the table says in words, and that is, for an enforcement perspective or a regulator perspective, the table says some materials, when recycled in certain ways, are waste and should be regulated as hazardous waste. Okay? And basically, again, we're looking at when a material, this hazardous secondary material, is used in a manner constituting disposal, it should generally be regulated as a waste and a hazardous waste. The same for materials that are burned for energy recovery, and the same for materials that are accumulated speculatively or stored too long. So any questions on the review of the definition of waste? I know we didn't go into the whole thing because this is not a waste identification class, but any questions on that before we go on? We did want to review it. Yeah?
Here, within the definitions of the actions you take to recycle, reclamation is not by default including under any of those categories, right?
Can you say the question? Let me go back to the table. The reclamation is its own category.
So it's outside the recycle definition?
No, it is a form of recycling, okay? And it is a form of recycling that should designate a material as a waste. So if I was to draw a big circle and label that circle, here's the universe of recycling, right? I put a line down the middle of it and put use or reuse on one side, reclamation on the other side. All recycling is use or reuse or reclamation. And in theory, everything's on the use or reuse side should not be regulated as a hazardous waste, and everything on the reclamation side should be regulated as a hazardous waste, based solely on the definition of solid waste in 660-61.2. It gets a little more confusing than that, but that's the theory. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Another way to think about this is, remember that we said recycling can be many, many things, and it really depends on what the material is that you're trying to recycle. So EPA, in adopting this definition of solid waste regulation, they were faced with a conundrum. They wanted their regulation to identify materials that should be regulated as a hazardous waste, right? But they get to a situation where I have a drum of some solvent, it's ignitable, it's sitting here, okay? And if I take that drum and I pour it down the storm drain, well, EPA's regulation should identify that, right, as being a hazardous waste and a solid waste. But if I take that same drum and I send it over here and use or reuse it in an industrial process, now it doesn't look like waste management, but it's the same drum, it's the same material. So the regulation has to go 2 ways at once when it addresses this drum, okay? And so that's what happens within the recycling, okay? So if a material is recycled in a certain way, use or reuse, then the regulation says it's not a waste. But if a material is recycled in the other way, I'm going to take this solvent and distill it, reclaim it, then it is a waste. Okay? Does that help answer your question?
Right.
And part of the reason for that is, EPA looked at recycling and said, recycling is treatment. It's very similar to treatment. We want to encourage recycling, so we are going to exclude some things from the regulations in order to do that. But all recycling is treatment, but not all treatment is recycling.
Yeah. What enough is, I guess, the regulation says accumulated store, treated, or recycling, except for provided in 51.3.2. When you go back and look at that, I guess treatment is the key word I have to kind of focus on, because it is reclaiming is considered treatment versus, recycle, if you would.
But it might be exempt treatment.
Right, right. So, okay.
Yeah, I understand what Diana's saying. I don't like to use that I don't like to use that approach to it because it's not linear for me. So what I would suggest to you is you look at use for reuse and reclamation when you get to 25.143.2, okay? And then decide whether the material is a waste and a hazardous waste, okay? In order for recycling to be treatment, by definition, the material must be a hazardous waste, okay? So a lot of materials that are used or reused are excluded because they're recycled in a certain way, okay? They are being recycled, but that recycling is not treatment. Does that make sense?
Because the waste is excluded.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to move into what's considered the highest form or a better form or a good form of recycling, and that's closed loop recycling. So again, the hazardous waste regulations when they were developed in the 70s were focused primarily on industrial processes, chemical processes, refinery processes. So the phrase use for reuse is kind of tied to those industrial processes. One of the things that happens in industry often is someone's using chemicals in their process and then they come up with a chemical somewhere out of that process, an output, that can go back into the process and be used. And EPA wanted to encourage that kind of activity. Their thinking is if the material's staying in the process and getting reused, okay, then that doesn't look like waste management. It's not going off-site. It's not getting disposed. It doesn't really have the potential to harm anyone because it's staying within the industrial process. So there's an exclusion in regulation that EPA adopted, and then there's an exclusion in statute, all right, in California. So you have two provisions that apply to closed loop. The first one we're going to look at is the regulation. In California, it's in 66261.4A5. Okay. And that regulation states secondary materials, again, there's that phrase again that's not defined. So something that's potentially a hazardous waste that are reclaimed, okay, so there's our recycling, the materials being reclaimed, and returned to the original process or processes in which they were generated, okay? Once they get to that process, they have to be reused in the production process. Again, there's your recycling, okay? But during the time that they're getting reclaimed and prior to going back into the process, they have to be stored in tanks, okay? And the system has to be entirely connected with pipes or other comparable and closed means of conveyance. This is EPA's way of saying this better look like an industrial manufacturing process, okay? It shouldn't look like a waste management process. More importantly, EPA is saying the waste needs to be staying in the process so that we feel comfortable excluding it, all right? Okay, the reclamation process cannot include combustion or controlled flame combustion, such as occurs in furnaces or boilers, all right? So the material can't be used as a fuel in a boiler. It can't be going into a furnace for reclamation or recovery. The materials cannot be accumulated speculatively, okay? And there's a time limit on how long they can store the material in tanks. And lastly, those bad kinds of recycling come up again. The material cannot be used to produce a fuel or used to produce products that end up on the ground. Any questions on the regulation text? No, thank you.
Scanner person.
All right, so let's look at an example. Right? Here, in this photograph, an exhausted etchant, a spent etchant, is returned to an etchant manufacturer, okay, where the metal is reclaimed from the etchant. Okay, so it's reclaimed. The remaining solution is used to make a new etchant. So there's your industrial process. And then it's returned back to the generator. Okay, that's your original process, right? What do you think? Does this seem to fit the text of the regulation? Anybody? Take a guess. Nobody?
I should have brought candy for those that venture to answer.
Did you say yes? Thank you for saying yes. Anybody else? Anyone want to argue the other side? Be devil's advocate? No? 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 All right. We have a very unfortunate situation where I don't have my notes, so I'm going to forget a few points that I would normally make. Anyway, so here's the deal. Let's go back. I like the picture. So what do you have to do here? What's the drill when we're applying the recycling law? We have to apply these words very carefully to the facts that we have at hand, all right? And so what's the deal? We have a spent etchant that's returned to the manufacturer, okay? So for me, that's the first thing, saying this is not closed loop. It's not on-site in the same process. It's going off-site to some other process at some other facility, okay? The metal is being reclaimed. We don't know how, but okay, it's being reclaimed. The remaining solution is then used to make a new etchant, okay? That sounds like we're regenerating that same solution. It doesn't necessarily sound like we're using that material to go back into the same process for which it was produced. It sounds like we're regenerating the same material off-site. Okay, and what about this? Is the entire system connected with pipes or similar conveyances? Well, no, what's happening? It's going onto a truck, and a truck is not a pipe system, right? It's not a closed system, all right? And we don't have enough information for the rest of this, but we don't know if those things apply either, so we can't say for certain it does qualify for the exclusion. Yeah.
Absolutely, this does not fit the definition of closed loop and
Right.
on-site, but it makes a lot of sense.
Makes a lot of sense, right? Recycling often does, right?
How do you do this? Because if it's a waste and you're sending it to the manufacturer, I would think that they would have to be a permitted TSDF.
And that's correct. So in California, this would not qualify for this particular exclusion. We'll look at some more examples later. But this process at the offsite facility would probably require a hazardous waste facility permit. So I guess something to keep in mind is that when you say, no, this material is not excluded because it's being recycled in a certain specific way, you're not saying you can't perform the recycling. You're saying the recycling process is regulated and you might need appropriate permits, et cetera, and so on and so forth. Right? The law doesn't say thou shalt not recycle or may not recycle. It just says this is not excluded. Okay, so let's look at another example. Okay, in this example, we have two photos to point out a difference here. We have plating rinse waters, which are processed by ion exchange resin columns, and then they're returned to the plating process. The water is returned to the plating process for use as a rinse water, okay? And I don't know how well the pictures show up there. In the top picture, you see a row of blue resin columns along the wall, and they have flexible hoses connecting the inlets and outlets of those columns, okay? They look a lot like the resin columns you see for making clean water at a pure water facility. The bottom, it's a little different. You have large resin vessels. Okay, I think there's 4 or 6 of them. And they're all permanently mounted, permanently fixed, and permanently piped, all right? But they're serving the same function as described here in words. So what do you think? Is this stuff excluded, this rinse water, or not? Anyone want to venture a guess? Okay, I hear 2 yeses. Anyone else? Yes for both of them or one of them? So for my 2 yeses, yes for both of them or one of them?
All right, so are both photographs describing part of the same process? Or?
These are 2 separate facilities.
But they're both recycling?
They're both recycling of plating rinse water in a very similar way, but we're making a case-by-case application of the regulation.
No.
No and yes, okay?
Yes, no.
How about yes and no? What'd you say there?
How about the top one?
So what do we think?
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Again, I don't have my notes. So here's what I think. The top one would probably not be excluded, or I should say would not be excluded if I were asked the question. And the reason is it has all those temporary connections on those resin columns. So what that means is what typically happens is some service provider, Culligan, Siemens, et cetera, and so on and so forth, will come in there. The first thing the guy's going to do is depressurize the system and disconnect all those hoses, and those resin columns are going to go out the door and onto a truck, okay? Well, you just lost your closed loop, right? This is not staying in a closed loop industrial process anymore. The hazardous constituents that are in that resin are now just traveling down the road, okay? This doesn't fit the thinking or the theory or the background behind the closed loop exclusion, okay? In the second scenario, it's different. Everything's hard piped. You're not going to lose track of those hazardous constituents to an offsite facility here. The second scenario may well, provided all the other conditions are met, may well qualify for the exclusion. Yeah?
If those tanks have a lifetime that they need to be replaced every 2 years, then they'll be excluded?
I'll probably modify that question. You say, what if the tanks are good for 2 years? Couldn't they have the exclusion during the 2 years? No, probably not. Again, the concept is that it's a fixed system that looks like a tank in a solid manufacturing process. Now, what if it's 10 years? What if it's 20 years? What if it's more than my lifetime? Then you're into a judgment call where you might say yes, but a short time frame, probably not.